Yuri Gagarin may not have been the first man in space, just the first to come back. The Soviet Union sent the first satellite into orbit. It sent the first dog, the first man, the first woman. It also, according to 40 years of Western reporting, sent men who never came back. Men whose names were spoken once in foreign newspapers and then erased. Men whose families were told to forget. Men whose voices, some claim, were recorded as they lost their lives. Outside Turin, in a converted military installation, two brothers built an antenna out of war scrap and pointed it at the sky. The year was 1957. Achille Judica Cordelia was studying medicine. His younger brother, Giovanni Battista, was studying law. But they had a shared passion for radio transmission and reception. They'd managed to assemble a homemade tracking system using surplus parts welded together in a garage workshop, and they were eager to put it to the test, to listen to what was in the air. They named their station Torre Bear. Within weeks, they'd picked up the beep of Sputnik 1. Within months, they'd locked onto the failing signal of Sputnik 2, carrying the dog, Laika. Italian newspapers profiled them as boy geniuses. NASA reportedly invited them to compare data. They were good. The pattern emerged slowly, then all at once. On November 28, 1960, the brothers said they captured a Morse SOS pulsing from a moving source above the atmosphere. The signal was leaving Earth, not approaching it. Something was up there, and it was already in trouble. "10 weeks before Yuri Gagarin would officially become the first human to reach space, on February 2, 1961, the antenna pulled something stranger out of the static. A slow, uneven sound, climbing and falling through Cold War noise. By their reckoning, it was a human heartbeat. The voices came in May. First, two men in Russian, asking for instructions. Then three voices together, one of them a woman's. And finally, on a date their logs give variously as May 17th or May 19th, a single woman alone. The brothers' transcription is chilling, quote, Listen, talk to me. I'm hot. What? 45. What? 50. Yes, I feel hot. I will re-enter. Then, there was a sound the brothers described as a heaviness in the throat, and silence. The tapes do not sound rehearsed. They do not sound like propaganda. They sound like terror. In Moscow, the response was silence at first, then a staunch, unquestionable denial. Finally, they released what was seen by many as a curated counter-narrative built around a single triumphant image. April 12, 1961. Yuri Gagarin, smiling, helmet under his arm. The first man in space. A propaganda victory so total that Western correspondents struggled to ask the obvious follow-up question. Was he really the first? Even as the Soviets ignored it, the Italian press followed up to the brothers' recording, and French radio replayed them. By the mid-1960s, the recordings had been reproduced across Europe and digested in U.S. magazines. The brothers gave interviews for decades. They never claimed a political motive. They claimed only that they had pointed an antenna at the sky and listened more carefully than anybody else, and the sky had answered. The Turin tapes were not the only crack in the story. Rumors trickled out of Prague. Soviet officials answered questions in ways that closed more doors than they opened. Names began to surface that matched no official roster, dates that matched no announced mission, and voices that no agency would ever claim. If the brothers were right, Gagarin had not been the first. There was an entire list of lost cosmonauts erased from history by the Soviet propaganda machine. The story did not begin in Turin. Before the Judica Cordelia brothers ever pointed their antenna at the sky, the rumors were already moving. Depending on which thread you pull, they began in Prague. In late 1959, A leak crossed the Iron Curtain. Western reports attributed it to a Czech communist insider whose identity was never confirmed. The claim was that 4 people had been lost in secret Soviet suborbital tests. The first was Alexei Ledovsky, reportedly lost in 1957. The others followed 2 years later. Andrei Mitkov, Sergei Shiborin, and Maria Gromova, all in 1959. The West German press picked it up first. Italian papers followed within days, and by year's end, the names had reached diplomatic dispatches in Washington. Nobody produced photographs. Nobody produced flight numbers. Just the names, traveling alone. In December 1959, the Austrian-born physicist Hermann Oberth gave the rumors an enormous credibility transfusion. Oberth was not a fringe figure. He was the German-Romanian theorist whose 1923 book on rocketry had inspired Wernher von Braun, the man who would build Saturn V. When Oberth told reporters in Bonn that he believed the Soviets had launched and lost manned rockets above the atmosphere, the Western press treated his statement as expert testimony. The pieces of the puzzle were falling in place. The narrative gained further intrigue through the experience of American science fiction writer Robert A. Heinlein, who was traveling through the Soviet Union with his wife, Virginia. During their visits to Vilnius and Moscow on May 15, 1960, Heinlein was speaking with a group of young Red Army cadets when one of them casually announced that the Soviet Union had just successfully launched a man into space. Heinlein wrote down the time. Several hours later, Soviet state media announced no such thing. Several hours after that, officials informed Heinlein and other Western visitors that there had been no manned launch and that the cadets had been mistaken. Heinlein did not buy it. That October, he published his account in the American Mercury under the title Pravda Means Truth. Either the cadets had been fed a lie by their officers and believed it, or the launch had happened and the Kremlin had buried the announcement before it could embarrass the regime. Heinlein favored the second reading. Heinlein had reason to suspect a cover-up. The Soviet Union announced its successes loudly. Sputnik, Laika, the dogs Belka and Strelka, who came home alive in August 1960. Failures were a different matter. The R-7 rocket, the cosmonaut training program, the launch site at Tyuratam itself, all of them were state secrets, some denied for years. There was only the absence of a ceremony, which could mean nothing had happened, or could mean something had happened that the state preferred to forget. Western intelligence collected the rumors anyway. By 1961, CIA files held a roster of names the Soviets had never spoken, and a question that refused to settle. On April 11, 1961, the British Communist daily, The Worker, filed a story from Moscow that, for the first time, documented and alleged a cosmonaut before Yuri Gagarin. Its correspondent was Denis Ogden. He had lived in the Soviet Union for years. He spoke fluent Russian and moved through circles other Western journalists could not reach. The world was eagerly expecting the launch of Yuri Gagarin, who would likely become the first man to travel to space. But according to Ogden, the first man in space had already flown. His name was Vladimir Sergeyevich Ilyushin, 33 years old, a decorated test pilot, holder of a world altitude record. His father was Sergei Ilyushin, the legendary aircraft designer whose name was on half the Soviet Air Force. And secretly, he had just orbited the Earth 3 times. The thing is, the flight had gone wrong on re-entry. The capsule overshot the recovery zone by hundreds of miles. Ilyushin was severely injured in the landing, with later accounts describing broken ribs, a concussion, and internal bleeding that took weeks to stabilize. According to the story, he was now recovering somewhere in the Soviet interior, or possibly in China, where the capsule had drifted across the border at the worst possible diplomatic moment. Moscow and Beijing were already pulling apart by 1961, and a Soviet spacecraft on Chinese soil was the kind of incident that demanded silence on both sides. Ilyushin, the story goes, was handed back through quiet diplomatic channels, his existence as a cosmonaut erased before it could ever be announced. The Kremlin had a problem. The launch had been prepared for months. The propaganda apparatus already had a date, a slogan, a ready-made global headline. What it did not have was a cosmonaut who could stand at a press conference and smile. So the Kremlin would announce a different cosmonaut, a clean one, a telegenic one. 24 hours later, Soviet state radio announced Yuri Gagarin. For believers, the timing solved a propaganda puzzle that nothing else would. How had the Soviet space program produced a flawless first orbit on the first attempt, with no previous human flight to refine the procedures? How had Gagarin's parachute landing, his recovery on a collective farm near Saratov, his medical workup, his choreographed interviews, all unfolded with such polish? Ogden's story circulated for weeks, then for months. The Worker was a small paper, but the piece traveled. Vatican Radio picked it up. So did the Continental Press, and eventually American news weeklies. Decades later, an American documentary titled Fallen Idol, The Yuri Gagarin Conspiracy, would revisit the Ilyushin theory with fresh interviews and a reconstructed timeline. Vladimir Ilyushin had vanished from public view for most of 1961, his name quietly scrubbed from sports rosters, no interviews given for nearly a year. When he resurfaced, he was visibly recovering from something serious. The official Soviet explanation arrived late, a car accident in 1960, severe enough to require specialist treatment in China. It was thinly documented, and it did nothing to dissolve what any careful reader of the Ogden piece could already see. For decades, the Ilyushin report would remain the most widely cited single piece of evidence that Gagarin had been preceded by another pilot, one who had survived, who was still alive, who could, in theory, be found and asked. Nobody dared. The Ilyushin story drew the headlines. The other names filled in the chorus. By the early 1960s, the catalog of alleged Soviet cosmonaut victims had grown beyond any single source. The names came from the 1959 Czech leak, from the Italian shortwave intercepts, from amateur radio operators in West Germany, from emigre rumor mills in Vienna and Munich. They accumulated in Western dispatches, in CIA digests, in the files of independent researchers at universities and think tanks across the United States. The logic was simple. Each rumor produced a name. Each name produced an obituary. Each obituary became another entry on a list that kept growing. From the 1959 Czech leak came Alexei Lidovsky, Andrei Mitkov, Sergei Shiborin, and Maria Gromova. From the February 1961 heartbeat tape came 3 Soviet airmen identified in subsequent press: Alexei Balakonev, Ivan Kachur, and Alexei Grachev. From the May 1961 distress call came Pyotr Dolgov and Gennady Mikhailov. The October 1961 rumor produced the strangest entry. A Soviet manned spacecraft had failed to re-enter and was now drifting beyond recovery, somewhere in the orbital silence between Earth and the Moon. There was no name, only the phrase reprinted in dozens of publications, lost in deep space. By the late 1960s, the catalog had stabilized at roughly 12 names. American newspapers ran feature pieces under titles like The 12 Lost Spacemen. A name with a date is harder to dismiss than a rumor without one. 12 names and 12 dates began to look less like a conspiracy theory and more like a casualty list. The hardest evidence was visual. In May 1961, 3 weeks after Gagarin's flight, Soviet authorities permitted the publication of a group photograph taken at the Black Sea resort of Sochi, where the Cosmonaut Training Corps had gathered with senior officials of the space program for a celebration. Among the men in the frame was Grigory Nelyubov, a 27-year-old fighter pilot who had served as second backup to Gagarin on Vostok 1. Nelyubov had stood suited up on the launch gantry the morning of April 12, 1961. He'd been third in line for the first spaceflight in human history. By the late 1960s, he was gone. Nelyubov had been dismissed from the Cosmonaut Corps in April 1963 after a drunken altercation with a military patrol at a Moscow area railway station. Soviet retouchers responded the way Soviet retouchers always responded. They airbrushed him out. Every reprint of the Sochi photograph from the mid-1960s onward showed the same image, with one fewer man. The space where Nelyubov had stood remained. The man did not. American analysts, comparing successive Soviet cosmonaut group photographs, found the same pattern across multiple frames. Faces present in 1961 prints, absent in 1965 reprints. Faces present in the first edition of a Soviet memoir, absent in the second. The Soviets were not merely failing to disclose their losses, they were editing them out of the historical record in real time. 20 days before Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space, a 24-year-old senior lieutenant in the Soviet Air Force walked into a pressure chamber at the Institute of Aviation and Space Medicine in Moscow and never walked out. His name was Valentin Vasilievich Bondorenko. He was the youngest member of Group 1, the original Soviet cosmonaut corps selected in 1960. There were 20 of them. 6 would fly the Vostok missions. Bondorenko was on track, by every account that survives, to fly one of the later flights in the program. Colleagues remembered him as cheerful and athletic, a former boxer, married, with a young son named Alexander. The test was a long-duration isolation run. Bondorenko was on day 10 of 15 days inside a sealed altitude chamber, pressurized with an oxygen-rich atmosphere. The procedure was standard. The atmosphere was not.
Now we gotta get the motor. We can't fly between 2 or 3 buildings.
NASA's engineers, watching the Mercury program proceed in parallel, would not yet understand the lethal implications of pure oxygen environments. They would learn 6 years later. When the Apollo 1 capsule burned on the launch pad on January 27, 1967, taking the lives of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. The Soviet engineers had not learned the lesson either. On March 23, 1961, Bondorenko removed the medical sensors taped to his chest, wiped the contact spots with a cotton ball soaked in alcohol, and threw the cotton aside. It landed on the heating element of an electric stove. In the oxygen-saturated air, the cotton caught instantly. His training suit caught next. By the time technicians could equalize the pressure and open the chamber, the fire had been extinguished, but the damage was done. Bondorenko had third-degree burns over most of his body. He passed away 8 hours later in a Moscow hospital. It was listed as an accident. The Soviet state classified everything. His name was removed from the public roster. His face was airbrushed out of the cosmonaut group photographs. His widow, Galina, was told to keep silent. The fire would not be acknowledged in any official Soviet publication for 25 years, until April 1986, when the journalist Yaroslav Golovanov broke the story in Izvestia during the early weakening of Glasnost. Western readers learned of it through a UPI dispatch the same month. If they had concealed Bondorenko, they could have concealed others. The first cracks came early. In 1963, the Soviet press did something they almost never did. It answered the rumors directly. Soviet publications produced photographs and biographical sketches of several men named in Western lost cosmonaut lists. Alexei Belakonov was alive. He was a parachute test specialist, working in stratospheric jump research. So was Ivan Kochur. So was Alexei Grachev. They'd never been cosmonauts at all. Their names had been pulled from Soviet popular science magazines like Ogonyok, where they had appeared in stories about high-altitude testing and grafted onto a phantom orbital roster. The serious dismantling came later, and in 3 waves. The first wave was the work of the American space rumor analyst James Oberg, whose 1988 book, Uncovering Soviet Disasters, laid out a forensic method for the field. Oberg compared rumored victims against known Soviet hardware capacity, against documented cosmonaut rosters, against the ballistic constraints of every announced and unannounced launch. The numbers did not fit. The names did not fit. He also demonstrated that the rumored deep space drifter was a ballistic impossibility. The Soviet Union simply did not possess a rocket powerful enough to accidentally send a Vostok capsule beyond Earth's orbit in 1961. Many of the victims, when checked, turned out to be living men, with civilian or technical careers. The journalist Yaroslav Golovanov, who would later break the Bondorenko story, spent decades tracing the names. He found Belakonev. He interviewed him. The man laughed about his own alleged demise. Golovanov found Ogonyak clippings showing the same individuals working in altitude chamber research and stratospheric jump experiments years after they were supposedly lost in space. The third wave was archival. After 2011, the Russian State Archive and Roscosmos released large collections of declassified documents from the Vostok program. The Wilson Center curated the Gagarin documents in English. The historian Asif Siddiqui, working from Russian primary sources, reconstructed the Vostok program flight by flight. The first 3 Korabi Sputnik test launches in 1960 carried dogs. In March 1961, Korabi Sputnik 4 and 5 carried a mannequin named Ivan Ivanovich. It wore a Vostok suit and a tape recorder rigged to broadcast pre-recorded audio, specifically so that Western interceptors would not mistake a test for a hidden human launch. The dummy explained the heartbeats. The voices fared worse. Russian linguists and former Soviet pilots who later reviewed the Turin tapes heard broken Russian, ignored protocols, and phrasing no trained pilot would have used in flight. And the CIA, the NSA, and Jodrell Bank, monitoring Soviet frequencies with equipment 1,000 times more sensitive than anything in a Turin garage, never picked up a single SOS, never recorded a single one of these voices. Vladimir Ilyushin had been hospitalized after a car accident in 1960, well before Gagarin's flight. The injury was real. The cosmonaut's career was not. He never trained for spaceflight. He passed away in his bed in 2010, never having orbited anything.